Story 1. Cold open, I didn't think much of the fog at first. It's normal where I live, especially on the rural stretches of highway where there aren't many lights to compete with it. But that night it felt different. It wasn't drifting across the road in patches. It was settled and thick and unmoving, like it had weight to it. My headlights barely reached past the hood of my car. Everything beyond that dissolved into gray. The reflective paint on the center line would flicker into view for a second, then vanish again. It felt less like driving forward and more like floating in place, suspended in something that swallowed sound and distance. Even the hum of my engine seemed duller, like the air itself was absorbing it. There were no other cars, no taillights ahead, no headlights behind me. Just empty highway and fog so dense I couldn't tell if the road curved or continued straight until I was already on top of it. Then I saw something. About 40 feet ahead, just at the edge of what my headlights could reach, there was a shape standing on the shoulder. It didn't move, wasn't walking. It wasn't signaling for help. It was just there. I leaned forward slightly, trying to bring it into focus. Trying to decide if it was a person or just my eyes straining against the haze. And then it was gone. No movement. No transition. Just empty fog where the shape had been. The worst part wasn't what I saw. It was how easily it could have been real. The highway shoulder. Credible setup. This happened a couple of years ago when I was driving back from my parents' place up north. It's about a 4-hour trip along the coast, mostly rural highway once you get past the last stretch of city lights. I've made that drive more times than I can count. It's quiet, a little monotonous, but predictable. I left later than I probably should have, sometime after 8. I had worked the next morning and figured I'd rather just get the drive over with. I was a little tired, but not dangerously so. It's the kind of tired where you roll the window down for a few minutes or turn the music up and you're fine. The first hour went by without anything unusual. Few cars passed in the opposite direction, then fewer and fewer as the road narrowed and the towns thinned out. Eventually it was just me and long stretches of dark coastline. Fog along that part of the highway isn't rare. It rolls in off the water all the time, especially at night when the temperature drops. Most locals are used to it. It usually comes in patches, low to the ground, something you drive through and forget about. That's what I assumed was happening when I noticed the haze starting to gather ahead of me. At first it was light, almost harmless. It's just enough to dull the edges of the trees lining the road. But it was building. The highway shoulder environmental unease within a few minutes. The fog thickened in a way that felt abrupt. One moment I could still make out the tree line and the curve of the road ahead. And the next it was like someone had pulled a curtain across everything beyond 30 feet. My high beams didn't help. They only bounced light back at me, turning the air in front of my windshield into a glowing wall. That stretch of highway narrows to 2 lanes with almost no shoulder. On one side there's a drop toward the coastline, on the other dense brush and trees. Normally it doesn't bother me. I know the route well enough to drive it almost on instinct. But with visibility cut that short, instinct doesn't mean much. There's also no reliable cell service out there. I remember glancing at my phone out of habit and seeing no bars, which shouldn't have mattered, but it did. It made the road feel more isolated than it actually was. Fog messes with depth perception in a way that's hard to explain unless you've driven in it. Distances compress. Objects appear closer than they are, or further. You can't judge speed properly. The world shrinks to a small, lit circle around you. The longer I drove through it, the more it felt less like weather and more like substance. Felt like driving through something alive. The highway shoulder, first anomaly. I'd been in that fog for maybe 20 minutes when I noticed a shape ahead on the right side of the road. At first I assumed it was a road sign coming into view, but as I got closer, the outline shifted. It was taller, narrower, human. There was a man standing on the shoulder, facing the road. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't walking toward traffic with his thumb out. He wasn't waving for help. He was just standing there, arms at his sides, body angled slightly toward the asphalt, like he was waiting for something to pass. I eased off the gas without really thinking about it. With visibility that bad, the last thing I wanted was for someone to step into the lane unexpectedly. As I got closer, I tried to look past him, expecting to see hazard lights blinking somewhere behind him in the fog. A broken-down car would have made sense. That's the only reason someone would be out there that late. But there were no lights, shadow of a vehicle, nothing but trees and white air. Well, he didn't turn his head as I passed. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there. The highway shoulder pattern reinforcement, I tried to put it out of my mind after I passed him. People do strange things, especially on isolated roads. Maybe his car was further back than I realized. Maybe I just didn't see it through the fog. That explanation was thin, but it was enough to keep me driving. About 10 minutes later, I saw him again. Same height, same dark jacket, same posture, standing just off the shoulder, facing the road like he was waiting for me specifically. For a second, I genuinely thought my brain had misfired, that it was replaying the earlier image. But as I got closer, I could see the details more clearly. The outline of his shoulders, the way his shoes were angled slightly outward. This is where things stopped making sense. There hadn't been any cross streets, no side roads. Hadn't passed another vehicle that he could have gotten into. I was the only car on that highway. As I approached, I told myself it had to be someone else who just happened to look similar. It had to be. But this time, as I drew even with him, his head snapped toward me. Not slowly, not casually. It was sharp and sudden, like he'd been waiting for the exact moment our headlights aligned. For half a second, we locked eyes. Something in my chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fatigue. The highway shoulder escalation, I told myself I was overreacting. Adrenaline has a way of amplifying things, especially when you're already driving through conditions like that. I tried to steady my breathing and keep my speed consistent. That's when my headlights caught another shape. This one wasn't on the shoulder. He was standing directly in the middle of my lane. I hit the brakes immediately, the tires humming softly against the pavement as the car slowed to a stop about 20 feet away from him. The fog seemed denser than it had been before, swallowing the edges of everything outside my windshield. The world narrowed to just him and the hood of my car. He didn't move. He didn't step aside. He didn't raise a hand. He just stood there, facing me. For a second, I wondered if it was the same man again. The build looked similar. The stance felt familiar. But this figure's face was harder to make out, partially obscured by what looked like a hood or the way the fog distorted the light. I flashed my high beams. The brightness flared against the mist, but he didn't react. No flinch. No shielding his eyes. Nothing. The silence stretched long enough that I became hyper-aware of my own breathing. That's when I realized I wasn't sure I was alone on that road anymore. The highway shoulder peak threat moment, I didn't know what else to do, so I shifted the car into reverse. My hands were steady at first, kept my eyes on the figure in front of me as I slowly rolled backward, giving myself space to turn around if I needed to. Then I checked my rearview mirror. There was someone behind me. At first it was just movement inside the fog, a darker shape, pushing forward through the white. Then it resolved enough for me to make out shoulders, head, the outline of a person walking toward my car from the center of the road. I felt my chest drop. I was boxed in. Adrenaline hit all at once. I threw the car back into drive and jerked the wheel hard to the right, cutting into the opposite lane to go around the man standing ahead of me. He didn't move. He didn't even turn. I accelerated just enough to clear him. And then something slammed into the back of my car. It wasn't a tap. It was violent. The entire vehicle jolted forward as a sharp, metallic crunch exploded behind me, loud enough to drown out every other sound. The highway shoulder rationalization attempt, I didn't stop. I kept driving, gripping the wheel hard enough that my knuckles started to ache. I expected to see headlights behind me, another car, something that would explain the impact. There was nothing. Within a few miles, the fog began to thin, almost as suddenly as it had appeared. The road widened slightly, and I could see farther ahead. I checked my mirrors again. Empty highway, no vehicles, no pedestrians, just dark pavement stretching behind me. That's when my brain started trying to fix it. I'd been driving for hours. It was late. I was tired. Fog distorts depth and shape, plays tricks on your eyes. Maybe I'd panicked. Maybe there had never been anyone there at all. Maybe I'd overcorrected and clipped a signpost or the guardrail without realizing it. I tried to believe that was the only explanation that let me keep driving. The highway shoulder, lingering uncertainty by the time I pulled into my driveway, my heart rate had finally started to settle. I sat in the car for a minute before getting out, convincing myself that whatever had happened out there had a reasonable explanation. Then I walked around to the back of the car. The rear bumper was crushed inward across almost its entire width. The plastic was cracked, and the metal underneath was bent deep enough that I could see where it had folded. It wasn't minor damage. It looked like something had hit me at speed. I crouched down and ran my hand along the surface, expecting to find paint from another vehicle. There was none. No color transfer. No broken glass. No debris on the road behind my house when I checked. I filed a report the next day, but nothing ever came of it.
How?
I can explain the fog. I just can't explain the impact. Transition one after that night, I started paying more attention to fog. Not in a paranoid way, just observational. It's the way it settles. It's the way it shifts. It's the way it makes familiar roads feel slightly misplaced. Fog doesn't just block your vision. It erases reference points. You lose the horizon. You lose distance. Street signs appear without warning and disappear just as quickly. Even sound feels off, like it's coming from the wrong direction, or from farther away than it should. It compresses space in a way that's subtle but disorienting. Driving through it feels like moving through a room where the walls keep rearranging themselves just out of sight. The thing that unsettled me most wasn't the figures themselves. It was how easily the environment allowed them to exist without context. Fog creates gaps, and your brain fills them in. For a long time, I told myself that what happened on that highway was just a bad mix of exhaustion and weather. But the second time fog changed something for me, I wasn't on a highway. I was somewhere I'd known my whole life.
Story 2.
The trail loop credible setup. This happened earlier this year during spring break. I'd gone back to my hometown for the week, which always sounds better in theory than it is in practice. Most of my friends weren't home. The town shuts down early. After a couple of days, I was just restless. I've always run when I don't know what else to do. In high school, I did cross country, and there was this 3-mile loop I used almost every afternoon. It starts in my neighborhood, cuts behind a line of houses, and then drops into a narrow stretch of woods that runs between 2 main roads. The trail itself is simple. One path. No forks. No alternate routes. It curves gently in a few spots, climbs a small hill near the end, and spits you back out onto pavement about a block from where you started. I've run it so many times that I could picture every section without being there. The way the tree roots push up through the dirt near the halfway mark, the slight dip before the hill, even the patch where the ground stays muddy longer after it rains. It's not deep wilderness. It's just a small wooded corridor surrounded by suburbia. Safe, predictable, or at least it always had been. The trail loop environmental unease. The moment I stepped outside that afternoon, I noticed the fog. It wasn't completely unheard of for that area, but it was thicker than I remembered ever seeing it, especially that late in the day. The sun was still technically up, but the light felt filtered, flattened. Houses across the street looked slightly faded, like they were farther away than they actually were. I considered skipping the run, not because I felt scared, just because it seemed inconvenient. Low visibility isn't ideal when you're moving at pace, but I told myself it would probably burn off once I got moving. It didn't. By the time I left the pavement and entered the wooded section of the loop, the fog had settled between the trees in a way that made everything feel enclosed.
Ow.
My visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet at most. The trail ahead would appear in short segments, then dissolve into gray. What struck me most was the sound. The woods are usually quiet, but there's still background noise, birds, distant traffic, wind through branches. That afternoon felt muted. Footsteps on the dirt seemed louder than they should have, like they were echoing inside something padded. I wasn't afraid. Not yet. But I was aware that the space felt smaller than usual, compressed, and that awareness followed me deeper in. The trail loop, first anomaly. I kept a steady pace through the first mile, without thinking much about it. Even in the fog, my body knew the rhythm of that trail. I checked my watch out of habit around the halfway point, and saw a little over 1.5 miles that lined up. It wasn't until I glanced down again and saw 2.5 miles that something felt off. At 2.5, I should have been approaching the end of the woods. There's a gentle curve to the left, then a short incline, and you're back on pavement. I know exactly where that point is. I could probably draw it from memory. But when I looked up, I was still surrounded by trees. Same dirt path, same narrow corridor of brush on either side. No incline. I I slowed slightly, thinking maybe I'd misjudged the distance. GPS signals can get spotty under heavy tree cover. It's common enough. Fog probably didn't help. I told myself the watch was wrong. That I'd come out of the woods in another minute or two, so I kept running forward. The trail loop pattern reinforcement another minute passed. Then two. I glanced down at my watch again, expecting to see something close to 2.8 or maybe 2.9. Instead, it read 3.02 miles. 3 miles is the entire loop. At 3 miles, I should have been stepping back onto asphalt, cooling down on the sidewalk in front of my house. But when I lifted my head, the trail ahead still looked exactly the same, flat, narrow, swallowed by fog. I slowed to a stop. For a moment I just stood there, listening to my own breathing and the faint rustle of leaves somewhere beyond the white haze. I checked the watch again. 3.05. The numbers were still ticking upward. I wasn't moving. That's when I realized something wasn't aligning. I shook my wrist, thinking maybe it was registering phantom motion. GPS drift happens. Dense tree cover can throw off positioning. The fog might have interfered with the signal. All of that was reasonable, but the trail itself didn't make sense either. I had never known it to feel this long. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees through the fog, half expecting to spot some fork or break in the path that I'd somehow missed. There wasn't one. It's just the same straight trail stretching ahead and behind me. The trail loop escalation standing there wasn't helping anything, so I made what felt like the only logical decision. If forward didn't make sense, I'd retrace my steps. The trail had always been straight. Running back the way I came would eventually lead me out. I turned around and started jogging in the opposite direction. Almost immediately, the fog felt heavier. That might have been in my head, but the air seemed denser, like it was pressing closer between the trees. The short window of visibility I'd had before narrowed even more. The path ahead was barely distinguishable beyond a few strides. I tried to keep my pace steady. That's when I heard it. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp. It was low and sustained, like a deep, uneven hum. Not mechanical, not quite human either. It rose slightly, dipped, then rose again, but without rhythm. Just a wavering tone that didn't seem attached to anything. I slowed for half a second, thinking it might be wind pushing through branches. It wasn't. The air was still. I picked up speed again, and the sound remained, not gaining on me, not fading. Just existing somewhere behind me at a steady distance. That was when the discomfort shifted into something harder to ignore. The trail loop peak threat moment, I started running harder, even though my legs were already burning from doubling back. My breathing got ragged, uneven, but I didn't slow down. The sound stayed with me, hovering at the same impossible distance, never closing in, never falling behind. I stopped trying to identify it. I just needed to reach the end of the trail. The trees ahead finally began to thin, the faint outline of pavement barely visible through the fog. I pushed the last stretch without pacing myself, ignoring the ache in my chest, until I broke out of the woods and onto the sidewalk. I stumbled a few steps forward and turned around. At the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by fog, something stood there. It wasn't moving toward me. It wasn't stepping back. It just stood inside the woods, tall enough that the top of its shape reached higher than I would have expected for any normal person. I'm 6'1", and this was taller than me by enough that it was noticeable. It swayed slightly, and the droning sound stopped. Completely. The trail loop rationalization attempt, I didn't stand there long enough to study it. I turned and ran the last block home without looking back. Later that evening, once my breathing had normalized and the initial surge of adrenaline faded, I told my parents what happened. I expected them to dismiss it, and they mostly did. My dad said it was probably some tall guy messing around in the woods, maybe trying to scare people. Teenagers do stupid things. Someone could have been making noise on purpose. My mom focused on the GPS issue. She said heavy tree cover can confuse signals. That part, at least, was easy to accept, and I tried. I've replayed it over and over in my head, adjusting details, convincing myself the figure wasn't as tall as I thought, that the sound wasn't following me. That exhaustion exaggerated everything. But every time I replay it, one detail stays the same. The distance. The trail loop, lingering uncertainty when spring break ended. I went back to school and tried to settle into my normal routine. Classes, gym, late night studying. Should have faded into one of those strange memories that lose their edge with time. It didn't. I still run, but I don't run trails anymore. If there's a wooded path near campus, I take the longer route around it. I tell myself it's because pavement feels safer, more predictable. There are streetlights, people, clear sight lines. I haven't told anyone else about that afternoon. It sounds thin when you say it out loud. Fog, a glitchy watch, tall shape in the trees. None of it proves anything. But what unsettles me is how easily the environment changed something I thought I knew completely. That trail was mapped into my muscle memory. I've run that loop hundreds of times. I've never run it again. Transition to after that afternoon, I started thinking less about what I saw and more about what I heard. Fog doesn't just blur outlines. It shifts the way sound behaves. It absorbs certain frequencies, carries others farther than they should travel. It bends direction. You can't always tell where something is coming from, only that it's there. On the trail, the sound had stayed at a fixed distance behind me, which shouldn't have been possible if it was attached to a person moving at a different speed. That detail stuck with me more than the silhouette did. I looked into it later, half out of curiosity, half out of a need to prove there was a scientific explanation. There are studies about how moisture in the air changes acoustics. It can make something far away seem close. It can flatten depth. That helped a little, till I remembered a morning a few years earlier when fog did something similar on open water. And water doesn't just carry sound, it amplifies it.
Story 3.
The rowing sound, credible setup. This was about 6 years ago, late September. A friend of mine, Edwin and Don, I had been talking for a while about kayaking a large tidal bay on the Washington coast. It's known for oyster farms and wildlife refuges, long stretches of open water that look almost endless when the tide is out. On a clear day, it's peaceful, even quiet in a comforting way. Neither of us were inexperienced. We'd both been kayaking since we were teenagers. Edwin had even worked a few summers as a guide, leading groups through coastal inlets. We didn't treat it like a reckless adventure. We had a GPS unit mounted to the front of his kayak, a compass clipped to mine, extra layers and dry bags, water, snacks, and a clear plan. The forecast mentioned fog, but that wasn't unusual for that area. Coastal fog typically burns off by mid-morning once the sun climbs high enough. We launched early, figuring we'd paddle out toward a small island near the center of the bay, drift a while, then head back before the afternoon tide shift complicated things. When we pushed off from the muddy shoreline, visibility was limited but manageable, maybe 40 feet in any direction. The water was calm, no wind. It didn't feel dangerous. It just felt quiet. Too quiet, maybe, but not in a way that raised immediate alarms. The rowing sound environmental unease. Once we were a few hundred yards from shore, the fog seemed to settle even lower over the water. What had looked like a thin veil from land became a ceiling that blended seamlessly with the surface of the bay. The horizon disappeared completely. There was no clear separation between sky and water, just gradients of gray fading into each other. Our visibility stayed around 40 feet, maybe less at times. Beyond that, everything dissolved. If Edwin drifted slightly too far to my left, his outline would blur until I had to adjust course to keep him within range. The water felt larger than it should have. Without landmarks, distance becomes abstract. You can't judge how far you've traveled or how far you still need to go. Every direction looks the same. Sound behaves strangely out there. The dip of our paddles into the water seemed louder than usual, sharper against the stillness. But the echo of it felt delayed, like it was coming back from somewhere farther than it should have been. Even our voices sounded flattened, slightly distorted. We made small talk at first, nothing important, just comments about the temperature, the tide, the way the fog was holding steady. Eventually, though, the conversation tapered off on its own. Neither of us said anything about it. But the atmosphere had shifted. The rowing sound, first anomaly, it started as a faint splash off to my right. At first I assumed it was Edwin adjusting his stroke, but when I glanced over, his paddle was resting across his lap while he checked the GPS unit. He looked up at me at the same time, which told me he'd heard it too. We both paused, letting our kayaks drift. The sound came again. It wasn't the dip and pull rhythm of a kayak paddle. It was heavier, slower. A deliberate plunge into water followed by the creak of wood, shifting under pressure. Oars. There was no mistaking that distinction if you've spent enough time on the water. Strokes continued at a steady pace, somewhere beyond the fog, maybe 100 feet off our starboard side. Close enough to feel present, far enough that we couldn't see the boat attached to it. Edwin called out a casual "Hey there," his voice carrying over the flat water. No reply. The rowing didn't pause. It didn't change speed, didn't acknowledge us at all. It just kept moving in the same slow, consistent rhythm. And for the first time that morning, I felt like we weren't alone out there. The rowing sound pattern reinforcement. We waited another minute, expecting the boat to drift into view. It didn't. The strokes continued at that same measured interval: splash, creak, unhurried, controlled. Edwin suggested we adjust our heading slightly, just to avoid crossing paths in low visibility. We angled a few degrees left, nothing dramatic. Just enough that if the other boat was moving straight, we'd separate. The sound adjusted with us. Not abruptly. It's not like someone reacting. It simply maintained the same relative distance. Still off to our right. Still pacing us. Oh, that's when I felt something tighten in my chest. If they were rowing independently, changing our course should have altered the angle. The volume should have shifted, either closer or farther. It didn't. The rhythm stayed constant, like it was anchored to us instead of the water. I wish I had turned back then. For a brief second, the fog thinned enough for me to catch a glimpse of something dark through the gray. A low wooden silhouette, the outline of oars rising and falling. It lasted maybe 3 seconds before the fog sealed over it again. Long enough to confirm it was real. Not long enough to see who was rowing. The rowing sound escalation without saying it outright. We both started angling toward where we knew the shoreline should be. Edwin checked the GPS again and gave a small nod, confirming our direction. We didn't frame it as retreating, just said it might be better to reposition before the tide shifted. The rowing continued. Splash, creak, splash, creak. We paddled a little faster now, not sprinting, but with purpose. The water resistance felt heavier than before, or maybe that was just the tension settling into my arms. Neither of us spoke. There wasn't anything left to say that wouldn't make the situation feel more real. The fog began to thin gradually, not lifting all at once, but loosening its hold. Visibility stretched from 40 feet to maybe 60. The outline of the water became clearer, subtle ripples forming where there had only been flat gray before. And still, the rowing stayed with us. It didn't close the gap. It didn't fall behind. It remained at that same impossible distance, slightly off to our right. At one point, I considered calling out again, louder this time, but I didn't. Because if someone answered, that would have meant we'd misjudged everything. And if they didn't, it meant something else entirely. The rowing sound, peak threat moment, the shift happened without warning. One moment the fog was still hanging low over the surface, and the next, it began to pull apart in uneven strips, like something tearing fabric from above. Visibility expanded rapidly, not gradually, 40 feet to 100, then more. Within seconds, we could see open water in every direction. I turned immediately to my right. Nothing. No rowboat. No silhouette. No disturbance on the surface that suggested recent movement. The water was flat except for the small wake trailing behind our kayaks. The rowing stopped, not faded. It's not moved farther away. Stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound had been. It felt hollow, like pressure had dropped inside my ears. Ahead of us, the shoreline came into view, dark and solid against the thinning fog. Trees, sand. A clear, uninterrupted stretch of coast. I looked at Edwin, expecting him to say something that would steady the situation. He didn't. His expression had shifted from confused to something tighter. And for the first time that morning, I felt a spike of anxiety that wasn't about getting lost. It was about being watched. The rowing sound rationalization attempt as we paddled toward shore. We started talking again, almost deliberately casual. Edwin mentioned how sound travels strangely over water, especially in fog. Moist air can bend it, carry it farther than expected. Maybe there had been another boat much farther out, hidden beyond where we could see. Maybe our change in direction just made it seem like it was following us. I agreed. It sounded reasonable enough. The human brain fills in gaps when it lacks visual confirmation. We both knew that. By the time our kayaks scraped into the shallows, we'd nearly convinced ourselves the morning had been exaggerated by weather and imagination. The rowing sound, lingering uncertainty. When we stepped onto the sand, I noticed wet, barefoot footprints leading from the water toward the tree line. We followed them back along the shoreline and found a small, dark rowboat pulled onto the sand, oars resting inside. We never saw who brought it to shore. Final closing reflection: I don't tell these stories often because none of them sound dramatic when you strip them down. No one was hurt. Nothing chased me for miles. There were no headlines, no missing persons reports, no definitive proof of anything unnatural. On paper, each moment can be explained away by fatigue, acoustics, bad weather, or coincidence. That's what makes them harder to shake. What connects them isn't the figures or the sounds, it's the setting. Every time the environment was calm, a highway I'd driven for years, a trail I knew step for step. Open water navigated by compass and GPS, places that should have been stable, fog didn't turn them into something else. It just removed certainty. On the highway, it compressed distance until a person could exist without context. No car, no explanation, just a shape standing where it shouldn't be. On the trail, it stretched space until 3 miles became something unrecognizable. The map in my head no longer matched the ground under my feet. On the water, it carried sound in a way that made direction meaningless. A boat could follow you without ever appearing. None of those environments were inherently dangerous. That's what unsettles me the most. There's a difference between being in a place that is obviously hostile and being in one that quietly shifts under you. In all 3 cases, I wasn't afraid at the start. I was calm, rational, focused on small practical things, keeping my speed steady, checking my watch, adjusting my heading. It was only later when I replayed everything that the instability became clear. I've tried to rationalize each incident separately. Fatigue explains the highway, GPS drift explains the trail, sound distortion explains the rowing. Individually, those explanations almost work. Together they feel thin, because what lingers isn't the visual details. It's the pattern, the way fog erased boundaries, the way it blurred the edge between normal and wrong without announcing the shift. There was never a moment of obvious threat, just a slow realization that something wasn't aligning. Calm environments turned unstable, familiar places made unfamiliar. Logical thinking stretched just far enough that doubt could slip in. I still drive that highway. I still kayak, still run, just not on wooded trails. Life goes on. But whenever fog settles in heavy and low, I notice how quiet everything becomes, how small the visible world gets, how easily a shape can form at the edge of perception. Most people see fog as an inconvenience, a weather delay, something that lifts by mid-morning. I don't think fog creates things that aren't there. I think it just hides them long enough for you to question whether they ever left.